So I hope you're enjoying it. I hope you're feeling somewhat brain stretched because it's been a flood of good information through today. I'm certainly almost overwhelmed with the amount of data coming in today. Now we move into one of the central panels of the day. This one has always been a bit of a backbone panel, so I took the liberty of extending it to a full hour. This is always the session which brings together the big CDNs, the big players, the big content providers, to look at what's going on at a macro level in the CDN world. And we have Jim Hall, who's one of our sponsors from Fastly. Jim, are you out there? I'm just going to check everyone's cameras working. Jim, have we got you?
Hey, yeah, Jim. I'm here.
Brilliant, excellent. And we've got Peter. Peter, are you there?
I'm here.
Excellent. We need a little bit of vocal because of the vision mixer that lives in the Zoom cloud somewhere. And we have Ted. Ted, are you there?
I'm here.
Excellent. We have Ted too. And Paul, we've got Paul.
Hi there.
Hey, Paul. I think we heard you. I didn't see you. Give us another cough or something.
I'm definitely here.
That's the one. Brilliant. Excellent. Oh, what a fantastic backdrop. You're still on set from Strictly or something.
Absolutely.
That's what we need from the BBC. Brilliant. Okay, so this session is really to look at specifically video workflow evolution within the CDN. So yes, CDNs do all sorts of things, and there's all sorts of movements. So we might touch on some of those, but I want to keep this fairly video centric. Because we've got an hour, we don't have to rush. We can take a bit of a breath and speak at a slightly slower newsreader pace. So hopefully we can pace ourselves a little bit. So first of all, I'm going to start with the elephant in the room, the pandemic question. I think I'd just like to understand, looking back over the last 12 months, what's changed? It's a very broad, open question, and I'm going to put that first to our sponsor on the panel, Jim. Jim, what's changed over the last 12 months in Fastly?
Well, first and foremost, the single greatest change was probably just how we work. Fastly has long been a heavy remote workforce with actually a substantial number of employees working remotely, but literally overnight, everyone working remotely fairly early on. In the pandemic, I think it was the 3rd of March, we got the note saying no one's going into the offices. And that took some getting used to for some folks, but for folks like myself, a lot of our job could be done anywhere. So I feel like it's been reported ad nauseum. Obviously streaming is way up. Particularly in Q2 and Q3, the Fastly saw a substantial rise in utilization as a result of the pandemic. So I would say those are the two biggest things for us.
Peter, how about in Akamai?
Yeah, I'd like to echo Jim's. Like we just built a brand new skyscraper in Cambridge, opened it in November, and we're all just starting to get used to this brand new lovely building with our great restaurant with views over Cambridge and Boston. And then they kicked us out and we weren't allowed to, we haven't been back since. So yes, it was one of the interesting things was one of our big products is our kind of zero trust security that we've been kind of pushing out there as part of one of the architecture that we can offer. We suddenly all became massive consumers of our own products very quickly and had to adapt to allowing all of our technicians remote access into the sites, which normally they would need like physical or some kind of biometric entry to get into different facilities. We had to organize supply chains when suddenly chips suddenly stopped being available and things stopped being shipped from our supply centers, and we had to then scramble to find replacements and basically recommission a bunch of old machines, which we thought, they're like 10 cents slower than these machines. We'll take those out of service. Actually, no, turn them back on. and so we've been through this several times now, but it was a big challenge. I think everyone kind of stepped up and met the moment. I did a piece recently where I actually looked at some of the things that helped us get here, which was, when we were designing IP to survive like nuclear war, we we put all these things in, like, error correction and congestion control and all these protocols, all the stuff that we then built HTTP on top of as a way of scaling up massively across multiple different networks. And then we built ABR to cope with bandwidth fluctuations and contention. And all of these things came together when we suddenly had this massive surge of capacity where all of those protocols and all of that things that we'd built up over time worked the way they were supposed to. And yes, there were challenges and there were lots of things we had to shuffle and move, but the foundation we were stood on top of was very strong, and it helped us get through what was a unique year. Let's put it that way.
How about you, Ted? How's the pandemic affected video?
Yeah. I think the trends are similar. Like the big one, obviously, is just increased utilization of all sorts of services. And, obviously with AWS, we've got, the cloud and all the backend services and customers trying to scale those up and adapt to changes in whether it's their workforce working from home and remotely, or things like, education, telepresence, and all those kinds of things. And then from a kind of CDN and edge perspective, obviously, CloudFront saw a tremendous amount of growth as a result, but we also saw some uptick in interest for some kind of newer adjacent services. So we've had something called Global Accelerator, which, as he was just talking about, in terms of different protocols and things like interactivity and video conferencing. So your non-traditional kind of not the broadcast one-to-many type of video solutions, but all sorts of other needs to get people face to face. And so, services like that saw a big uptick. We had launched the interactive video service under Elemental, which was really kind of a platforming of the Twitch platform, which can take, really lightweight, video acquisition from people with a webcam or OBS or things like that, and get that out to audiences with interactivity and things like that. So a lot of different experimentation and really kind of, reaching out to try new things with new services.
Brilliant. Paul, how about you in the BBC?
The short version has just been astonishing. And literally, it wasn't quite overnight, of course, but literally everything, the way we worked, what we did, what we thought our jobs were, just got flipped on its head. In the space of what felt like, just mere minutes. As an organization pushing out, many 24/7 channels of content, video and audio, so much of it studio based. That then, really had to, that got blown up almost overnight. And the amazing thing is we kept going. And actually, if you, from an audience point of view, I think very, very, very few people, if hopefully no one, from a broadcaster or an IP point of view, noticed any difference. But what we had to do changed. If we cast our minds back to March 2020, when the lockdown started happening in the UK. From a pure video perspective, I mean, those announcements, those events were huge. They were huge on broadcast, but they were huge online as well. And we had to really make we had processes and procedures in place to cope with large traffic events. That's part of the bread and butter of what we do. But even that wasn't enough. We really had to think on our feet and move traffic around and really, really think about how to do that reliably. And that was a real challenge from a video delivery point of view, an application delivery point of view. It pushed us in all sorts of different directions. But we did it, and our ways of working have adjusted. And we've learned an enormous amount this past 15 months about all the assumptions we had about how we do large traffic events, and how we cope with the BAU has changed. And so it's been a huge learning process for us.
So I'd love to go and dig into production side stuff, but this is a video. This is all about CDN and delivery issues and so on. However, Ted touched on it, and I think it's a sort of question which is pertinent in some ways. Obviously, video conferencing exploded, and video conferencing isn't necessarily the staple bread and butter of CDN, but I'm sure it's touched all of us, not just in how we work, but in actually the sort of traffic that you're dealing with in your networks and so on and so forth. I, for one, have found it sort of interesting how everybody has decided to turn their webcams on, even in the video industry. I don't know about you guys, but until last year, I never turned my camera on. It was a distraction. People get Zoom fatigue sitting in front of a camera grinning all day. Actually, we could probably have done CDS as an audio conference almost as effectively. And I think even in our community, I'm turning my camera on more and more, and slightly reluctantly. But that aside, has video conferencing had an impact on your different respective networks? And I suppose you've all mentioned changes in working processes. Has that been a traffic problem for you guys? I'm going to go around sort of in the same order. Jim, let's start with you.
So video conferencing is generally done over a different protocol than what Fastly supports. Where video conferencing does come into play so for example, with Zoom, it becomes a webinar to reach a certain scale. And when they want to go to a more traditional HLS-based one-to-many approach, that's where we see traffic from video conferencing.
Peter, how about you? Have you seen impacts of video conferencing traffic, whether it's on the intranet internally or whether you've become the go-to to how to solve video problems because you happen to know about video, or how's it affected you?
Yeah, so in my previous employer, I worked for Cisco, and once they bought WebEx, they insisted they put webcams on everyone's desks, and we had to have the camera on. I mean, so I came up with a novel plan of having a photo of me on the wall. I could point the camera if I didn't want to be on camera, and my picture's frozen for a bit right now. But so I'm actually quite comfortable on camera. I think I have aspirations to finally make it from distribution up to the studio and actually on set at one point or another. But internally from us, we found a lot of people using Zoom as a production studio and then having basically porting it out, like Jim said. So they'll make an HLS version and then send it out to a many audience. And we've had, big sports franchises doing that for kind of, like after interviews from the kind of the coaches and from the kind of the key players and stuff, and using that as almost like a primary distribution path to get it out to affiliates. Again, because they couldn't roll a truck out there. They couldn't send somebody out with a camera. So it's like, all right, put him in front of a laptop. We'll back all that through HLS to the studios. They'll pick that up, screen grabbing, or from an HDMI port, and then they'll feed that back in. So you saw a lot of news broadcasts with some fairly sketchy kind of quality interviews, but they tried to reproduce the same experience with, the tools they had available, and we kind of strung that together. From our side, we saw a big uptick in like API traffic. So maybe not the actual video production, but a lot of the back-end authentication and a lot of the other ancillary services that make this application work. So the video itself, most of the time, is like a WebRTC type connection, which is not a native traffic we support, but we'll support a lot of the wrapper around that. So a lot of the security, authentication, and the management interfaces. So.
Ted, how about you? I presume quite a lot of Zoom's traffic, for example, is actually coming off the AWS infrastructure at some level.
I'm sure there is a fair bit. I know that we work with them closely. So I would echo the previous comments in terms of, from the CDN perspective, kind of traditional HTTP delivery. A lot of the video conferencing stuff is on other services and other parts of the network. We obviously do some of the more kind of broadcast-centric one-to-many kinds of sessions, software updates and downloads, API traffic, as previously stated. So again, I think what was beneficial for us in this is because there are a few different services in the overall AWS portfolio. So on other parts of the network, as I mentioned, things like the Global Accelerator service doing non-HTTP protocols, so we can do WebRTC, we can do MQTT and UDP and some other protocols there. So I think services like that picked up some of the missing pieces from traditional CDN when you start getting into interactivity or one-to-one sessions or one-to-few sessions, where kind of traditional caching and things like that aren't as big a factor.
Right. And Paul, how about you? Has the sort of the explosion of video conferencing had an effect on network management, on considerations about where you're provisioning services in the BBC?
Yeah, so it's interesting. We sort of see it from both sides. The team I'm in, the bit of the BBC, we're the ISP for the BBC. So not only do we do contract distribution, put it on the network and supply it as origin to our CDNs, we also, we're doing the desktop browse, we're doing the connectivity for everyone. And so that's, We definitely saw an uptick there. In fact, we had the kind of tools in place, so there wasn't, a mad scramble to kind of wire things together. Our colleagues in news production, who do the kind of contribution, are already well versed in this. So they had the bits to wire together to make it work. But we definitely saw the uptick in traffic, and we did have to do some. A little bit of, if you like, traffic optimization, prioritization on the egress to make sure that traffic was being treated with the correct QoS to make sure that was deadly protected. Once we learned that what was going on in the production world, that just became more and more important because so much more of it was going on. And I'm sure, as has been said, all this, we're all now used to kind of news contribution looking a bit shaky, but everyone's gotten used to it, and actually that's becoming the norm now. And I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon. That is the new.
You stopped a little march on me there with my next question, because I was going to ask, people's expectation of video online, I think, has possibly changed because people are more tolerant of bits of broken up audio, bits of blocky video, and so on, because they're just so much more engaged with it. And we're going to talk in sort of the next sequence of questions is really about quality and so on. And I think that's central to CDN propositions at the moment. But do you think that the market as a whole is more tolerant of, I don't want to say lower quality, but more accepting of a good enough level that might have been perhaps lower than before the pandemic? Do you think that you're able to get away with a little bit more? Peter's smiling. I'm going to point that at you, Peter.
I think cell phones lowered our expectations for audio quality, and I think Zoom's done the same thing for video quality. That being said, I still think, I still think when you're watching what you expect to be a professional presentation, something I'm going to sit down and watch media. If I'm watching a movie and it's going to look slushy, I'm not going to be happy with that experience. We don't. What we have seen is people have consumed a lot of media, so people now really can maybe are being better trained now to differentiate between what's really good, well-produced 4K HDR-looking content, and now they're starting to look at other content and go, well, maybe it doesn't look quite as good. And a lot of the challenges with it's very noticeable when you go back and forward between like an interview that's been done over Zoom and just fed in versus a studio shot. And so now I think maybe people are more tolerant, but people still appreciate quality, I think would be the answer I would give.
Ted, have you got any comments on that?
Yeah, I would agree and maybe go like slightly further. I don't know that people are more tolerant depending on the situation, the venue, the content they're consuming, right? So like if it's content I'm subscribing to, paying for, it's that entertainment experience. I'm still looking for the, that living room TV broadcast level, cinema level of experience, and whether it's the audio or the video quality, video resolution, I think they're still expecting a very high level of quality there. And I wouldn't see, customers also being tolerant of compromises there in terms of the platform's ability to deliver. I think on the interactivity side, when you're dealing with, the education environment or the teleconferencing, telepresence, I do think that there's more tolerance. Not only because, you realize you're dealing with a whole bunch of potential last mile issues. You've seen the issues of, even my camera's kind of going light and dark here just from, backlighting issues. So, that's not gonna, degrade from the overall, content we're presenting and the discussion we're having and things like that. So I think, it depends on the situation.
And Paul, I wouldn't have imagined seeing a Zoom feed, a Zoom quality feed, or an iPhone or a phone contributed feed live on air 5 years ago. But it seems to be a very regular occurrence these days. And how's that affected the culture in the BBC and the acceptance of content?
We've always had a sort of a culture, specifically in news contribution and news gathering. There's always been a culture there of innovation, and that's about speed. That's about turning over the stories and getting that as quick as possible. And so that was happening before the pandemic. All the way back to ENG and stuff in the 80s, right? So that's always been there, and that's continued. And I think there's a huge acceptance there that actually it's about the story, it's not about it looking beautiful, and that continues. So now we just see lots of, slightly crap Zoom feed, but that's okay. It's about the story it's being told. In our drama entertainment, those areas of TV production, that nothing's changed there. And I think there's been some really creative solutions come up with editorially as well as kind of production point of view that have kind of enabled lots of productions to happen, therefore the content to get produced, but it never looks anything than professional. And so those standards absolutely have not dropped. From a delivery point of view, bringing it back to more of the CDN angle, we've seen some really interesting trends that have changed. We're seeing more, for instance, our HD, all our content's HD, our HD content, the high bitrate stuff, and even some of the UHD, we're seeing more of that arriving into mobile networks, into kind of 4G, 5G networks, and that's been a trend that's been accelerating over the last kind of few months. And do we accept a reduced delivery quality there? Absolutely not. We want that to be as good, if not better, as fixed line broadband, as broadcast, which is what we're measuring ourselves against. So that stays the same. That just needs to keep getting better and better.
Now, Jim, you mentioned CMCD as a sort of as an emerging technology in some of our preamble and so on. Tell us a little bit about that and educate me actually more about that, because
Sure. So CMCD stands for Common Media Client Data, and it is a specification, CTA 5004, that was created by the Consumer Technology Association, the makers of the Consumer Electronics Show, CES, in Las Vegas every January when we are in lockdown. And basically, it is a way for the video player to pass information about its status up to the CDN. And the CDN can then do some things with that. For example, it's a set of key value pairs. They can be passed as either a query parameter or as a header value. And the CDN can read that data and do things with it. So one of the key values is called the next object request, or NOR, which usually shows up as the stream is starting up. The CDN can read that value and proactively go and retrieve an object from origin, prefetch it, and place it at the edge pop where the original request came from, so that it's not being pushed down to the client, but it's just there and ready for when the subsequent request comes. And there's tooling to indicate that we're in a startup mode. So we might want to say, read the playlist manifest and actually proactively go fetch a few segments from the origin and do the same thing as I mentioned with next object request. It could potentially do things like modify the manifest. So if it's an HLS manifest and it's got a really high bit rate at the top of the manifest, which would be the first one to load, but we know that the bandwidth, which is communicated as part of the CMCD specification, is too low, then maybe forcibly downgrade the connection or the segments or playlist that is sent down. The folks at Akamai, Will Law, have been massive champions of this. Will's done, I think, at least 3 different presentations on it in the last 12 months, possibly. And it was as part of that sort of awareness that he started generating that the Streaming Video Alliance became aware of CMCD, and we've actually adopted it as the base framework for the quality of experience working group. And we are going to add some bits because the goal is to create a very holistic view of what is actually happening from the very beginning, as far back as the encoder, if not even any contribution that's going into the encoder. We'll take whatever we can get, all the way down to what the end user is seeing. And so the Quality of Experience Working Group has put together an end-to-end demo of CMCD coming from Akamai, Fastly, and Lumen, data being fed from the player to those CDNs, and then passed to a logging aggregation system that not only takes, and this is the really important bit, not only that the CDN logging data, but also the CMCD data. Because one of the things that is extraordinarily difficult to correlate is a rebuffering event reported by the player to CDN log data, because there's a lot that goes on between A, B, and C that may or may not be indicative of rebuffering. So it helps everyone get to the root cause of an issue faster as a result. So Fastly is a huge supporter of the efforts of CTA and Akamai, actually, for the CMCD. There are some limitations. Currently, CMCD only is implemented in the -IF player, the industry forum player, natively. There are, however, some solutions coming from folks like TheoPlayer that implement CMCD virtually player independently, and supports Dash, supports HLS. I can't remember if it supports ExoPlayer and AVPlayer, but that will be the holy grail, is getting HLS in an iOS device with CMCD. And once we have that, all our collective lives will be far simpler the more companies that require and request CMCD implementation. And I apologize for taking way too much time.
Everyone else was nodding. That was a great explanation. And I do like it on this panel when everyone talks in a complimentary way about other players in the sector. That's great. But let's turn that to Peter. So where is CMCD in Akamai? You know, it sounds like Will's been a driving force behind it.
Will Yeah, Will definitely has been a driving force in his role as CTA Wave Chair. So I did pop the link to the CTA spec. It's free to download from CTA's website. Jim, I think you covered most of the highlights there, so I won't try and repeat. I'll just try and put it in a little nutshell here, which is what it means is for every request we make of the network, we're piggybacking a little piece of information so that the CDN can log. It can either act on it or it is going to log it into its log lines, what the health of that player was at that moment. And so if everyone's in a multi-CDN world, Paul, you're probably the poster child of an entity that has its own CDN and uses all of the CDNs. And so trying to decipher Jim's logs, my logs, your own logs, and then correlate that all together, it's like, well, did the player miss a segment because one was served from Akamai, one came from us, one came from my own? It's like, did it miss two segments or just my logs in different places? CMCD provides this kind of linkage now, this common language between all of our log lines so that we will know that, yes, these were consecutive session requests, that the health of the player. We can use these flags like the startup bit that Jim mentioned to say, oh, this is a bit of information like an init segment the player needs every time it starts. Maybe we can change its cache priority. We can keep that in cache. Going out further beyond that, we've seen some really cool presentations, and I've got a paper I'm going to put in the chat as well, which is from Ali Began's paper that he's going to present later this year, which is showing how using the data to adjust the priorities or the delivery rates of packets such that it improves fair share usage. So he took a limited pipe, like a 10 meg pipe, and hooked up 10 clients. Now they should all get 1 meg each. Now we know that AVI doesn't quite work like that. So they all end up thrashing between 0.5 meg and 2 meg, fighting each other and having a really nasty experience. By using that data and then adjusting the playback rates, again, this is a PhD project, but this is just showing, kind of scratching the surface of some of the potential here. So very excited about this. We think this may be a way to finally get a lot more QoE data out, and be able to act on it in real time, and not have it kind of be wrapped up in silos of my logs versus somebody else's logs, where we have to interpret it or we have to run some kind of ML algorithm to try and decipher what happened. This is explicitly telling us what happened. So that's my 2 plugs for it. Oh, and one more thing, there's another spec coming called the CMSD, which is the other way around. So from the server down to the client. So one of the things that people think is that CDNs know everything about the health of a region and a network in a session. It's like, we know how healthy our server is and how much the data left us. The fact that it then hits a mobile gateway that may be having a problem or is in a poor RF area, we don't see all of that. So we can say, hey, we're doing well. And the client can say, well, I'm having a bad time. And we can then maybe move better. So that's coming soon. If you're interested, please check out CTA's website or reach out to Will directly.
I'm trying to brew up variants on the RUM terminology that would invert that. So Ted, talking about real user measurement and so on, what are the, aside from CDN and so on, what are the other techniques that you're deploying and you're helping clients use to measure their end-to-end QoE?
Well, I think, traditionally there's been a lot of, kind of third-party vendor providers providing those services. So you have your Convivas or your Muxes or your Nice People at Work. And I think that's really been what's filled the gap to date, and why CMCD is a great kind of advancement is it takes those well-established practices and hopefully helps drive solving one of the bigger problems, which is kind of ubiquity and commonality of the data that's being reported and implemented in the various players, right? So if we can drive some of the native players, as was mentioned, to implement this, then you get a nice consistent set of data and metrics coming out of all the players. And that's really been where some of these vendors have solved the problem, because, the average media, producing organization, doesn't have the technical depth or the time or the resources to write, 30 different player implementations. And even when you do that, you can't always get exactly the same metrics or the same heuristic out of every player. So I think this will hopefully drive some commonality. And then, as others have said, I think combining that to get kind of the whole end-to-end view. So we certainly have server-side data through Elemental Media Services. They produce a lot of the kind of signal acquisition, transcoding, transmuxing, so much of the kind of back-end generation workflow components, and being able to feed health and status and QoE data in from those components and combine it now with that RUM data. I think that's really kind of the holy grail, is to be able to see, hopefully in some kind of graphical form, how your stream is progressing through all that infrastructure, all the way out to different populations of viewers.
And can you talk, sorry, just to stay with Ted for a second, can you talk a little bit about how in the network you respond to that type of data? When you see that you've got a problem, what are while it's easy for a multi-CDN service provider to just say, well, go to a different CDN, when you've got a problem inside your network, what are the sort of steps that you take internally to go, oh, we're getting a problem in this region, we need to do what? What are the sort of things that you do?
Well, so every CDN will have different technology and different approaches and different data that they're generating, but almost universally you're going to be dealing with looking at kind of the internet weather map, how you're going out and measuring using a lot of different telemetry that you get from your edge pops, from different web properties. As Amazon, we have different web properties that are getting a lot of data about client populations, DNS servers, things like that. And so we have experimentation systems where we'll send traffic to different places to see, to measure, what provides the best experience at a given point in time for a given, end user population, and break that down into, ASNs and /24 IP blocks and all sorts of things to try to really get granular about what is the health of the broader internet and what is the health of our infrastructure. And so every service is going to do some slightly different variation on that theme. And then what you're doing is basically when you see issues in latency, or you're seeing issues in availability or reachability, then you're influencing your traffic management, systems to shift that traffic around. It might be via DNS changes. It might be via BGP advertisement changes. So you're basically trying to stay ahead of any widespread performance or availability problems.
And I'd like to take the same question over to Paul, but just briefly, I saw you walk into the background. I thought that was a virtual background. You're not really on the set of Strictly, are you?
I am not. I'm in my bedroom in Croydon.
That's very strange. Okay, so yes, so I mean, iPlayers was traditionally one of the first places I heard about real user measurement being deployed widely and so on. Can you talk a little bit about how you measure and respond to issues of quality and make decisions about traffic optimization and so on and so forth within your environment?
Yeah, I mean, because iPlayer's been around forever, it seems. It was right at the beginning, 2007, it launched, and I was actually charged with building the first AV analytics system on top of it. So I've got a bit of previous in this area, and there was the problem there back in those days. There was nothing in the market. You couldn't go out and buy this stuff, so we had to invent it. And as a result, we've now got we've now got our own system to do this. So the kind of stuff Peter just talked about, the challenge of having to knit together CDN logs and marry that with client-side data. We've had to do that. We've been doing that for 15 years, and we've solved that problem. But obviously there's an upkeep to that, which obviously I'm really keen that the industry comes together and produces a standards-based approach like SimCD. Because that could ultimately, if that works across the board, that could really standardize things. What was the original question? Sorry, it was
just about how you respond. How do you manage this type of feedback, and what sort of response can you actually take when you get data that something's going wrong or something's less than perfect?
Yeah. So we got two views this day. We've got the client side view. So every player that we can get client side measurement into, we do. It's not universal, unfortunately, but we as far as possible work really hard to try and make the measures that we get from the client consistent, and we bring all that together into one system and process that as fast as possible. And so we got a real-time view of what our current live streaming picture looks like, and we can break that down by the obvious dimensions, by the which kind of player, which ISP it's going to, what quality they're receiving, that kind of thing. And we feed that through to our operations team, and they can take operational decisions in real time. If we notice the network having a problem, there's a media set that's having a problem. Maybe an encoder's gone wrong, and we've got a problem at back end, and that's resulting in average bit rates going down, or something. Then we've got a set of levers we can take to take that out of service or rebalance traffic as we need to in relatively real time. So that's key for us. Challenges is it's not consistent. It's not consistent across players. It's not consistent necessarily across different kinds of streaming we're doing. It's not consistent necessarily across HLS or Dash or etc. And we've learned as a broadcaster and as a content supplier to deal with that inconsistency. But it's something where we would love, we want to continue to try and iron out, because that's going to make our world a lot easier to make those decisions to have better quality.
Perfect. Okay, so we've got just about 20 minutes left, and I've got three kind of big pools of subjects to focus on. We've touched on it just briefly, but let's talk about live. Jim, have you seen live traffic changing over the last 12 months? And I don't mean just in terms of pandemic utilization, but also in terms of technologies that are available, in terms of ways people are contributing and distributing. Talk about the fastly live environment and what's happening in that space, and feel free to touch on latency as well, because I think that's always a good topic.
I guess I think the thing that I find most frustrating is we still don't have low latency at scale. In production, broad adoption, et cetera, et cetera. There's all these different flavors, and no one's been brave enough to go, right, I'm going to do my next big footy match in LLHLS, at least not that I'm aware of. And I'm just, that it's so frustrating because we're ready. As a CDN, we are ready. We have been ready for low latency on multiple fronts, multiple formats for a really long time. And we would just love for it to see the adoption that everyone, lots of companies ask us about it. It's a box that gets ticked in the process of in very early on in the sale process. But still no one's doing it. So that's just personal frustration. Fastly is ready when they are.
Do you think the blocker is? Is there a single blocker or is there a specific thing?
It's a combination of things. I think honestly, I think everyone's holding their breath for LLHLS to be ready at scale, and for somebody else to take the plunge and actually do a large scale broadcast. Excuse me, with LLHLS.
Confidence.
The problem we have is, you know, people have dynamic ad insertion and server-side ad insertion processes that are encumbered by LLHLS, and there's work that is being done, but you know, the types of events that are operating at that scale are often ad supported, and so you know, you until that's resolved, I don't think we're not gonna see anything at the, you know, sort of maybe not Super Bowl scale, but you know, even like, you know, English Premier League on Boxing Day type scale. But in terms of live streaming, we're seeing more and more of it. We are seeing some interesting things around new rights being acquired and needing, and those rights previously were held by a broadcaster. Mm-hmm. And now they suddenly need very large amounts of bandwidth in interesting locations in Europe that don't necessarily have the best infrastructure. So we're seeing some interesting things around scaling to meet the requirements as broadcast is eaten by streaming. I'm in a very interesting position because I remember my first NAB, and when I said I work for an online video company, an internet video broadcaster, I was met with the response, "What's the internet?" And this was 1997. And, you know, I'm kind of abused by the, you know, oh, streaming is the redheaded stepchild of broadcast. Well, guess how most 4K is delivered these days. So anyway, so live is definitely on the rise, certainly for Fastly. I wish low latency was, and there are some interesting alternatives to LLHLS that are also being developed, like HESP for ultra low latency, like startup in 500 milliseconds, that I find really fascinating and really gives you that zap, like you just hit the button on the remote and poof, there's your broadcast image. So.
Peter, how about you in Akamai? And actually, just before you answer that, Ted, if you could have a look at the Q&A, there's a question which seems to be focused on Amazon, which I might come to in a second if you fancy picking that one up. But Peter, how about in Akamai? You know, live.
Yeah.
Live. What's
absolutely. So obviously there was a bit of a drop off in the major events, the Olympics being postponed, and a lot of the big, you know, tournaments and things that happen in even numbered years, which is actually why we had a little bit of spare capacity lying around for when everyone else decided to consume all these other catalogs. So from a low latency perspective, we are seeing quite an uptick in people. I kind of survey what people do for the big, you know, NFL event in February each year. And this year I noticed a lot of the sports, you know, the sports app people were running 2-second segments, where previously they're running 4 or maybe 6. So a lot of people have been trying to pull the latency down into that kind of 10-second territory. You know, low latency, you have to define what the term means. You know, I try to pick it to broadcast. So I'm going to say, you know, let's call it 4 to 6 seconds, because it turns, if you're in Europe, it's closer to 4. If you're in the US, it could be 4 to 18 to 20, depending if it's coming off a satellite. You know, there's lots of, we've got to put all those advertising boxes in the chain, because, you know, we love adverts, right? And you know, to Jim's point, advertising is one of the blockers. For a major marquee event like a big football game, for example, a lot of the ads are baked in because those ads are so valuable. There's no value in replacing them with you know, Jimmy's Ford dealership on the corner. You're not going to blow out you know, a $6 million F-150 ad to replace it with that. So that's actually an easier environment. We have been seeing is that there are kind of 3 low latency technologies. There are people who are just reducing the segment size. We're running 1 second HLS. With the new Apple players, because they're built now with LLHLS built in, they've actually changed their latency kind of default model. So you can get 4 seconds end to end if you just do 1 second HLS. Before, if you did that, because of the way AV Player worked, it would force you to like a 7 to 8 second window. It had this kind of desired buffer, but now it's happy to operate at a much lower point. So getting down to sub 5 seconds isn't as hard as it used to be. And we're seeing people take advantage of that. LHLS, we've got a lot of people launching. So you'll hear big announcements soon of some fairly major players doing that. Dash low latency, we have partners who are doing that. Maybe not at, you know, they're doing it like 100,000 viewer type events, not at millions yet, but they're proving the tech. They're kind of doing this. The challenge there is you've got to build your own client on Apple. LHLS is going to be the thing that unlocks it on all, because it'll run across all of the verses, not just the Apple verse. Whereas Dash is almost blocked by, you know, you can't run it for certain, the native player won't consume a Dash manifest. You have to either do some conversion or you have to do something to get around, do that. So, you know, LLHLS will be big because it will be that lingua franca that works across everything. Dash low latency has a foothold, and HESP, which I think Jim mentioned, we see a lot of people using that proprietary format, which Theo have now formed an alliance around. We see some packages, and we see, again, it's CDN friendly, so we'll just deliver those bits. But I think we're going to see a lot more low latency this year than we did last year, and I think people are getting comfortable with operating at those lower points. Advertising will
been saying that forever, though.
No, well, okay.
Ed, can I come to you for a sec? The question in the Q&A about partnering with telcos in Kenya, I'll leave you to answer that specifically, but slightly more broadly, what are the challenges when you're offering these global services in waiting until you can offer them globally, or just having to deploy them where they're supported in North America, Europe, and then rolling them out and so on? Do you have an homogeneous environment that you can deliver these services in yet, or do you find that you have to territorialize the rollout of technologies and so on?
I think the general approach is to be fairly globally consistent. There are a few exceptions of that, and obviously AWS has a number of different services. You might have GovCloud, or if we've got infrastructure in China or places like that have some, you know, specific operating and regulatory environments and things like that. But in general, services are designed to, you know, deploy and operate globally. You know, the actual rollout and kind of infrastructure build out, you know, for some of the regionalized services tend to be, you know, you might start in a particular geography and then expand over time. From an edge services perspective, though, we're almost universally kind of like, you know, globally designed. And so again, while there might be it might take time to get into a particular network in a particular country or something like that. And that's just a function of, you know, working with the local providers, building out infrastructure, you know, particularly during COVID, some of those, you know, facilities and infrastructures and, you know, equipment importation, like some of those kind of, you know, mechanisms slowed down or had challenges, supply chain, et cetera. But I think, you know, in general, you know, we deploy things like CDN and edge services and DNS and things like that on a global basis, and they're globally consistent.
And is latency something that your customers are demanding, or lower latency?
Of course, like that's the universal constant, right? You know, lower latency, higher quality, higher throughput, better availability. Like those are the kinds of things that, you know, from an Amazon perspective of, you look for those things that are kind of universal customer expectations and demands, like faster shipping time or more selection or better prices, right? Like those are the things on the internet and in the web services space that are just like a constant expectation.
I remember asking Roger Penrose at Streaming Media West a couple of years ago, as he was introducing LLHLS. Once there's a low latency HLS out there, why would anyone use HLS? And I still haven't really got a convincing answer from them. Paul, as a broadcaster, how important is latency to you today? I'm sure it's on the roadmap, and I'm sure it's a pressure, but how important is latency to your distributions today?
It's really important because we do a lot of sport, and it's really about sport. And so, we got the problem whereby you're watching the FA Cup final on broadcast, and then you're seeing that relatively real time. But if you're watching it in your house and you're watching it on iPlayer, and you'll hear the cheer from your next door neighbor kind of 2 minutes before you see the goal, and so we know as a user experience that kind of sucks, and it's one of the arguments against using IP as opposed to broadcast at the moment. The challenge we've got is that every time I talk to a commercial CDN, they're trying to flog me some sort of low latency product, standard or otherwise, and that's kind of cool. Actually, it's the actual origin to distribution problem that we've got. Portion is not the latency problem that we currently have. It's in the acquisition. It's where we tee off the live streams from the broadcast chain, and the chain we've currently got is it's built for resiliency, not speed. And so, when that was done, the technology really wasn't there to do this at the resiliency we wanted, to the speed that then, we're getting into, talking about 5-second latencies. So we've got some re-engineering to do there way before we then have to back a horse in terms of what low latency end distribution technology we'd use. And so for us, it's kind of a watching brief. We'll get that part of our house in order as part of natural technology refresh and aiming for that as a goal. And then as and when there's an emerging standard, then there's no doubt we'll seek to adopt that.
Okay, perfect. And I've got two more sort of areas to quickly focus on. Although I've just had a question from Indra Klein. Just if anyone's got a comment on the regulatory landscape, put your hand up and we'll jump on that question. Otherwise, if something comes to mind in the next few minutes, then okay, let's park that. And if you guys do have any thoughts on the regulatory landscape, if you could hit the chat room and just type a message back after the session, that would be cool. So two other things to just quickly touch on in the last 8 minutes. There's a lot of other data that's passing around in the CDN space. We've got obviously, Peter's mentioned in the sort of list of questions I've got here, the sheer scale of API traffic today and so on. And I'm sure that there's just an enormous amount of data that needs processing and computing. I guess that probably segues a little bit into edge computing, or at least what we're going to talk about towards the end of the afternoon in edge computing. But do you guys have some more comments on it? Peter, can I point that at you to sort of?
Absolutely.
We have only got 7 minutes, so let's
I'll try and compress it like we do with API headers. So Jason being very verbose. I actually went and pulled the stats the other day because I was like, well, how many APIs do we process? And it's 3 trillion last year we processed. 300 trillion. Sorry. So that's like almost 1 trillion a day. That's a lot. That's up 30% year over year.
Is that equating to the outbound traffic? I mean, it sounds like you're becoming symmetrical.
Well, that's an interesting, I could get a whole thing about details. So this actually accounts for about just over 80% of all hits on the CDN are API calls. Because if you think about it, applications and websites are they're just a framework that then makes a bunch of back-end calls and the kind of spider's web of calls. I mean, a single web page probably has 50 elements of bits of JavaScript and things it pulls in from areas. And all of those pull in little bits of data from APIs to assemble the experience, either the app or the, and so there's all of these little tiny transactions, and they're very different than big segment being downloaded or a huge file of the next latest release of this game or an OS update. And they have to be very, very quick. And so a lot of what we've done is in our pivoting into edge compute is, edge compute always talks about people have got all these things, these big things they want to do at the edge of the network. And I said, there's a massive number of very small things we need to do at the edge of the network, which is servicing these API calls. And so a lot of what we've done with we call our Edge Worker product, which is basically you can write JavaScript that runs right on the very edge, just at the edge of the access network, where we can do things like, a basic application like autocomplete. When you fill in a form on a website, most websites, we have examples of where there's probably 500,000 different possible responses, but actually 20% of them come down to 500 answers because people go to you know, the water company's website and they type in bill. Or they take the keywords are really obvious because people tend to type in the same things for the same site. So those are things we can do actually in that JavaScript at the edge. We can fill in the autocomplete, so it doesn't have to go back anywhere. Or it doesn't have to fill in, or it doesn't have to download a very heavyweight API in JavaScript object with all of the keywords in it. We can do that right at the edge, and we can update that much quicker than and do things like that. One of the things we did really recently was we implemented right before Christmas a fair queuing mechanism, because there were lots of launches of brand new gaming systems, and like brand new sneaker launches are ridiculous. But all of that requires a fair share. You know, like when I join the site in the queue, I want to make sure that my place is in line. A certain console that was launched, when they launched it, they did it client side. Within about 5 minutes, that was hacked, and people were jumping the line. And it was like that thing was on Reddit so fast you wouldn't believe it. So one of the things we did was we implemented an edge worker that would implement this fair queuing. And as we came into the front end of this year, when vaccines started becoming available, guess what? That same technology that helped people get their, you know, stand in line for their sneakers or for their consoles, helped us offload a lot of these cities and municipalities and governments all around the world who were trying to come up with a queuing system to get people in to book vaccines. So we actually bundled all that technology we use for retail back up as a whole vaccine distribution product. So that was a really cool use of both APIs and this, you know, edge compute, and this trying to do these little microtransactions right at the edge.
So AWS, you know, famous for starting off with EC2 and infrastructure as a service and so on. You know, that's a fairly centralized edge compute model, but obviously you've now got wavelength, you've got much deeper reach into the networks and so on. Like, we're dealing with all these new types of data. We've got a requirement for edge compute. What's going on within the Amazon environment for dealing with this type of these types of challenges?
Yeah, we kind of need a whole session on that. But in brief, you know, there's just so many different services that are all experimenting and going in at the same time different directions, and over time in more convergent directions. And so, for example, if you take CloudFront, we've got you know, a compute engine called Lambda at Edge that can do, you know, some fairly heavyweight functions in Node or in Python. We just launched something called CloudFront Functions, which moves a subset of that functionality kind of even further out to the edge. And so you can do, again, I agree with the example of doing kind of these lightweight transactions, you know, a lot of HTTP request response inspection and manipulation, things like that. But instead of kind of like a rules engine format, it's a scriptable, and, you know, you can do a lot of really kind of customized logic. And then I think, you know, when you mentioned things like wavelength and outposts, like, you know, those are specialized deployments right now targeted at things like 5G networks, and targeting the concept of mobile edge compute that the 5G industry has really been promoting to the service providers. And so, like, I think what you're going to see over time is some pockets of different capabilities that pop up in the right places. And, you know, what AWS is trying to do over time is bring at least a, you know, a consistent developer experience, you know, a set of tools and APIs and CLI and things like that, you know, control plane that allows the developer basically to say, here's a task I want to perform. I can put it in the right place in the network at the right time for the right workloads, and make decisions based on performance and latency and cost and scale.
Cool. Paul, just a quick, I'm going to try and get a 1 minute answer out of you, and then a 1 minute answer out of Jim for two different questions. So Paul, piracy. Peter actually mentioned it in the call. Piracy with live sports returning. Pirates are back. But what's your counter piracy strategies from the BBC's point of view? Have you got significant things happening? Are there new technologies on the horizon? How's piracy and distribution for you?
Really challenging. It seems like every time you lift a rock, someone's found a new and interesting way of taking something around, you know, nefariously from an IP stream, and all of a sudden you find out it's being distributed via satellite across huge swathes of the planet. So it's real whack-a-mole at the moment for us. You know, our challenge is to uphold our rights agreements in the correct way. And there's always a degree of pragmatism we have to apply, because it is whack-a-mole. And so it's a constant headache. We're constantly dealing with it. And I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon. Therefore, the innovation's got to catch up.
An arms race. And Jim, so my last, you're still there, aren't you? I can't see you on the map. There you are, Jim. Yes, cool. So Jim, just one last question for you, which I think is a lovely open-ended one to give to the sponsor on the panel. what do you think is going to be the big groundbreaking changer in the video workflow space in the CDN over the next 12 months?
I think we're really seeing, we're in the midst of it now, and that is that the production model is shifting to the cloud. Doesn't really impact the CDNs too much, other than it's the sort, it's where we will be picking up our origins from. But we're seeing more and more customers just moving everything to IP-based acquisition. And more stuff is happening on some of the great stuff that AWS is doing for media and entertainment, and their media live products and services. I think that's just going to continue.
Well,
from a CDN perspective, I'll go with what Peter says, and we'll see LLHLS on a big scale.
I have to plug that we're demonstrating LLHLS with Peter's network, but you'll hear about that a bit later on. So listen, that was a sort of central panel of the day. It's all about video workflow evolution. We've had 4 fantastic panelists: Paul, Jim, Ted, Peter. Thank you so much for your time. We could have gone on for another, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours, I think, had we had the chance. It's a shame there isn't a bar to retire to, but stick around. We will leave the very last session of the day open. So if you are still here and people want to chat, we might be able to actually facilitate that a little bit. But I'd like to thank you once again, and also thank Fastly for sponsoring. Thank you so much.